is a little video on the new feature in WoodSynth 3.0, namely the new sequencer. So how do you get to the new UI? Simply in the big expanded view, you click on the sequencer button here, and oops, there it is. If you're in the more classical view, like you see here, you click on the left part of the sequencer button. Let's go to the bigger panel, it's easier. We go to the sequencer, or you can also move around the window as you please. Let's first reset to the default and then go over the new functionality here. So first of all, you see of course that the 16 steps are now completely in one row, which makes the overview much easier. For each step, obviously, you have the same parameters. So let's start with that. You have a mute button, which makes it easier or it has the same effect as turning down the volume. However, new is that you now can also skip the step. If you switch the button here, the button now becomes a skip button. The difference obviously being that mute does not change the duration of the sequence, while skip would, suppose you have 4 steps, would effectively mean you have 3 steps. However, more interesting is that now the step also, or the step on or skip, also has a probability. So now you can have a step not only on all the time or off all the time, but only once in a while, depending on the fader or the rotary. The probability here of 50% obviously would mean that on average 1 time out of 2 it's muted or skipped, whatever you selected here. Already present in the previous version was of course the notes. You can choose the delta offset of the semitones of the ground notes. You can set them here. You can also record those. That was already present in the previous version. For the Mac users, if you press Shift, it will add 1 octave. If you press Alt, it will add 2 octaves. iPad users, sorry, that's not there. But then, of course, the Mac version is a little bit more expensive. What do we have else? Okay, you can set the note or the semitone which will be played in the step. But new is also that you can switch it to range, and the range is also in semitones, and the range, as you will see later, is actually used when you switch on random notes. In the previous version, the range was fixed for all notes, and actually the random was, or the random switch was also on for all notes. And now you can per step define the range, so some notes can have a little random range, others can have a bigger one. That brings me also to the random note probability. Like I said, in the previous version there was 1 random button which switched on the randomness for all the notes. Now you can say, okay, we only switch on the randomness for this note. So if we, for example, have a simple sequence of 4 notes, first let's listen. Say switch on the sequencer. Okay, it's muted, that won't help. Okay, so you hear the same sequence all over. Now let's put the randomness first to a big value. So here you can hear that only the second step will turn into a randomness, and the range is of course set by the range there. If we would set the range to a small value, let's say 4, let's hear. It's random, but it does not deviate too much from the programmed note in here. Okay, the volume was of course present in the previous version, but now new is that it's a nice big fader, which makes it easier to set it. I also added a feature that you can actually draw the curve, which makes it easy if you have to do a quick change of all your volumes instead of doing it fader per fader. That's the drawing of the curve. parameter 2 and parameter 3 were already present in the previous version, so I'm not going to say too much about it, except that I added additional settings. So you can now set the ADSR completely per step, which was not possible in the previous version. Now another nice new thing is the ratcheting. Ratcheting is the repetition of the same note. So, for example, let's say, okay, let's first switch off the randomness here, and let's make the release time a little bit shorter. Okay, sequencer, where are you? Here. Now let's listen. Okay, let's slow that down a little bit. You will hear it better. So that's ratcheting. You have 9 patterns to choose from. Virtually all patterns are here. Yeah, just play with it. Also interesting here is that also, like for the randomness, the ratcheting also has a probability knob. So if I reduce this, you can now, let's take another one. You will now hear the ratcheting only now and then. Okay, the idea is clear. Normally it's set to 100%, of course. Okay, that brings us to the variations. Variations are just a new set of parameters and contains all the parameters in each step, of course. So, for example, if I go to variation 2, they start with the same level, the same values, of course, but let's change it here to 1 octave higher. You will immediately hear the difference then. 9 and 0, oops. So now, if I play variation 2, and variation 1 was... variation 1 still has the ratcheting on here. Let me switch it off. Oops. Okay, now you can set all the parameters differently in one variation, or you have 4 variations in total. Use cases would, of course, be in a song structure, variation 1 being the verse, variation 2 the chorus, variation 3 interludium, etc. Another use case could be that you set each variation to only 1 cycle, and that makes up that you would get either a 32 or even a 64 step sequencer. Now, how do you select which variation will be played? That's determined by the variation mode here. Normally it's set to select, which you saw already. You just select the variation and that one will be played. I also added a random mode just for fun, but the more interesting one, of course, is the playlist. In the playlist, which you can call here, you can add, for example, I can add the 3rd one, a number of cycles. I can add the 4th one. So you can add any combination here of cycles and variations to build up your song structure, or to build up a sequence which will vary quite a bit over time. So now let's, for example, let's first switch this off. We'll immediately talk about that one. Let's only do 2 of them, otherwise it will take too long. So let's delete this one and this one. So now we will have a playlist of, let's say 2 cycles and 4 cycles here. So now just listen. If you noticed, the little blue LED indicates which variation is playing. That's not the same as the one which is selected. So I did this so that you can change the parameters in any of the variations while the playlist is still playing, and that you don't that doesn't switch before your eyes, so that you're changing parameters in the wrong variation. Now another new thing here is, of course, the variation glide. What does that do? It will affect two parameters, namely the volume and the note values. The note values are, of course, very interesting. It means that it will, while playing the cycles of variation 1 and going to variation 2, it looks at each value in the next variation actually, and will divide the notes from variation 1 to variation 2 in the number of cycles and go up there. So let's switch this one on. So remember, we had an octave higher. So if we switch on variation glide, let's just select here 4. Okay, so now let's play this and listen. So now, well, you just hear it. So the variation is done per step. So variation 1 has here 0, which is the ground note. Variation 2 has 1 octave higher. So it means that it calculates the difference between the two. It sees, okay, it's 1 octave. We had 4 cycles. So 1 octave will be divided by 4, and that gives you the increment per cycle that it plays. And it's doing that per step. If this one would be set to the same value as in variation 2, you would not hear a difference there. Interesting to notice that the variation glide is a global button here, but you can also switch it on per step by choosing the variation glide button here, and then you can decide per step if you want the glide or not. Now, you may say, okay, if I, for example, take in variation 2 a smaller value, let's say in the first one we had 0, let's take 2. Of course, if we divide that by 4, we end up with semitones or with half semitones, which normally you don't get. So obviously it will then go to the nearby or the nearest semitone. However, another new feature here is the subsemitone. If you switch this one off, it will effectively play the subsemitones which could occur. You can see that in a preset I made, and you can also see it here that the semitone will not be exact. Let me increase this here a little bit. Of course, let's switch that one off. I'll show you, or I'll let you hear my preset where it's used more. Also interesting, if you do the variation glide, you could decide that you don't want any semitone, but that you want to stay in musical by selecting the limit scale. I added some scales here, so if you set the limit scale, this one also works for random notes, but also for the variation glide. So each calculated semitone will then be rounded off to the nearest one, which falls into the scale. Okay, I think we had the most important ones here. Okay, I have a copy and paste. You have a restart if the playlist is somewhere in the middle and you want to start it from the first index again. These values were still in the older version. Resync can be used. It's described in the manual a little bit better. Take into account that if you use random skipping or not random mutes, but random skipping, it becomes very unpredictable how long a sequence will last, and that it definitely will not be repeating after a couple of bars. If you want this to happen after some time, you can resync after a number of bars so that it starts again with the first step and the first sequence. So these were about the new features for the sequencer, a lot of randomness and probabilities. I hope you enjoy playing with it. Any feedback is of course welcome, and see you in another video. Bye bye. No, I was going to let you listen to the presets. Let's select this one. Most of the new presets are here. For example, this one is one which is using the subsemitones. So just to end, I'll let you listen to this one.
you.